Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I am taking a look at Rocket and Mantis, the two other characters in the Guardians of the Galaxy update, at least for the main patch, since the second part, or the mid-month patch, will have Groot and Gamora afterwards. I decided to do both of these characters in the same video, just to give you a comparison of how they stack up to one another, and just how vastly different they are design-wise and performance-wise, even though they kind of meet some similar criteria, like being blast characters and also being support characters. My initial impression when I first tested these characters was that Rocket's uniform seemed like it was kind of rushed. His kit doesn't really seem too cohesive or logical, and the skills don't really flow that smoothly with the mechanic that they put in place. And you'll see what I mean as the clips are shown. Mantis, on the other hand, seems like a really good character. She has great support passives, and the character does really well as a standalone character too, so she can basically function like a hybrid or as a dedicated character either in PvE or PvP. Just for reference, the builds that I tested on both Rocket and Mantis are with no damage proc. I'm simply using an invincible obelisk and a pretty basic build with only a few Urus and a fully awakened ISO 8 set for both. Usually when a character moves from T2 to T3 or gets their awakening, the first thing I do is test their uniform just to see how that does without taking into account their T3 or awakening skill. So for that, I test them on stage 99 of World Boss Ultimate Thanos, as well as either Proxima or Black Dwarf, depending on the type of damage that they deal. What I found from testing on my account is that if the new uniform, even at T2, can complete stage 99 of Thanos with about a minute left or more, then the uniform is basically on par with the modern upgrades and can potentially be good, but that also depends on how they do on World Boss Legend Null. Versus Black Dwarf, Rocket was able to complete the stage in a little bit over 60 seconds, but similar to Thanos, I found that versus Black Dwarf or Proxima, the character with their latest uniform and no damage proc should be able to complete the stage in 60 seconds or less, so this is a little bit behind par. With the T3 unlocked, Rocket is able to improve his clear time versus Thanos by about a minute, and then versus Black Dwarf, he improved the clear time by about 30 seconds, completing the stage in under 60 seconds itself. One of the things that was implemented with this latest uniform is that they reintroduced one of the mechanics that Magic and Luna had, which is that you can use a skill to reset either the same one or another one and then kind of work from there. So for Rocket, for example, his first skill now provides you with a damage proc for the next two skills, and that skill resets after you use it, or basically use another one, so you can basically just kind of weave it in between skills to get that damage proc across multiple skills. However, the issue with this mechanic is that the skill has pretty much a 0.5 second cooldown on it, or just a slight cooldown on it, which keeps you from being able to quick tap through the skills to keep weaving this damage proc between them. And it makes the rotations really clunky, but besides that, it also makes it that you can't quickly cancel through multiple skills to transfer that proc, and you basically have to go with something like a CTP of Rage if you want to make the most out of his kit and the damage that he provides with the latest uniform. One of the other issues I found is that registration seems to not function too well with that skill reset mechanic. Oftentimes you want to press the first skill button so that you can weave it in between the other skills, but it won't register your button press, and it can basically mess up your whole rotation. Also, another reason why I would recommend a Rage for a PvE centered build over something like a Destruction or an Energy is because that first skill has hits as soon as you activate it. So even though it provides a buff for the next two skills, one of them is basically for the first skill itself, and you can't transfer that to the next two skills. So for example, if I wanted to instead transfer those next two skill procs to something like the 4 and 5, it wouldn't work since one of them would automatically be activated from the first skill itself. So it would only go to the next skill that I activate, which could either be the 4th or the 5th only. What I'm trying to say is that they made it a lot of work for you to get that 80% damage throughout your whole skills, but other characters have it much easier, and they don't really even have to bother with doing all of these kind of tight rotations. They either have a lot of damage accumulation or even have skills that have up to 100% damage proc, and all they have to do is just press that one skill. So the buff that, or the proc that the first skill provides should be well over 80% to kind of match up with the amount of work that you're doing. Rocket still does well though. He completes stage 9 of Null without leadership or supports with about 2 minutes and 50 seconds left, but the tests with the higher stages is where you kind of see how he falls off a little bit. One of the other things that I almost forgot to mention is that his tier 1 passive just doesn't make any logical sense at all. It provides an energy damage increase to Guardians of the Galaxy tagged characters, but the issue with this is that, first of all, not all of the Guardians of the Galaxy characters have that tag, which I believe they'll probably rectify in the mid-month patch, but nevertheless, even if those characters got that tag, only half of them can really use it, because the other half of the Guardians of the Galaxy, Drax and Gamora, are physical damage, and they don't even benefit from this passive. The reason this doesn't make sense is because the passive only provides a buff to a percentage of characters. And if it's only targeting a very small amount of characters, or even possibly one character, then the buff that the passive provides should be pretty drastic, because otherwise that passive is useless to the rest of the roster, right? So if it only applies to one character, the value should be much higher, like 80% damage increase or something like that. But if it applies to multiple characters, then it's fine for that value to be a little bit lower, since it applies to more of the roster, which would be the case for Rockets if the damage wasn't restricted to energy damage. If it was instead all attack, then it's perfectly fine, but as it stands, the passive just doesn't really make sense logically, and that the value it provides doesn't really match up. As you can see from this clip, he's not really too bad, since he is able to complete stage 24 by completing the first phase in those 2 minutes, but he basically does it with no time remaining. When I took him to stage 34 and this time added leadership and supports, he wasn't able to complete it, and I finished with about 3 health bars left, but with a little bit better rotations, I'm pretty sure that he could have completed it, but again, with no time remaining. In Alliance battle modes, the character is largely just going to be a support for Star-Lord. He's missing the silence tag in his kit for that particular season, so in Alliance Battle Extreme, he is only good for really 2 seasons. But besides that, he doesn't seem to have that many hits in his kit or really deal that much damage. Even though I didn't have a damage proc on him, I was only really able to score around 4 million in the full 3 minutes, which with other characters that are decent, not even really good for Alliance Battle Extreme, should have been able to score that within the first minute and a half. The rotation for Rocket is a little bit messed up, like I mentioned, but if you want to get the most out of his damage, this is essentially what you have to do. First, you use the first skill, and it'll basically activate the 3 activations that you have for it. So the first time that you use it, it won't provide any buffs to anything. It basically just starts the 3 activations and cooldowns that you have. So essentially, you would want to use the first skill, wait about a half second, and then use the first skill. This will activate the first proc that you can transfer. Then you go into your 5th skill, which you delay cancel after he kind of shoots up in the air, so you can throw those nets. Then you do the first skill again, cancel that into the 3rd skill, which you then cancel into the 1st skill again, and then go into your 4th skill. So to sum up, the rotation is basically 1, wait about a half second, and then 1, cancel, 5, delay cancel, 1, cancel, 3, cancel, 1, cancel, 4. When you have your ultimate unlocked, you simply substitute the 4th skill for the 6th skill, and that is the rotation there. As you can see, the character isn't bad by any means, but he's basically just average, or maybe a little bit better than average compared to the upgrades that characters get now in 2023. This is kind of unfortunate considering how iconic Rocket has become, that he isn't really anything too special, and you can see that because even though he basically has 3 supports in this fight and a leadership, he's barely able to complete Dormammu in that 2-minute window to be able to complete the fight entirely, despite the fact that he doesn't have a damage proc. For a character that I would say is definitely less iconic than Rocket, Mantis is basically outperforming Rocket in every category, and you can see in these clips that even with a similar build and no damage proc, she's able to complete stage 99 of Thanos about 30 seconds faster than Rocket. Versus Black Dwarf, she's about 20 seconds faster even at T2. Then when the character is awakened, she's about 20 seconds faster than Rocket at his T3. And versus Black Dwarf, she's about 5 seconds faster than Rocket, but is basically reaching the upper limit of how quickly this stage can be completed, since she's basically doing it in 40 seconds flat. Unlike Rocket, you can also see that her performance doesn't drop off when she goes into the higher stages, and she is substantially easier to play. You don't have to worry about kind of managing different cooldowns and things like that. You simply just do your regular rotation, and she still ends up doing more damage than Rocket, who has to do all of that work and ends up doing less damage than her. Unfortunately, if you want to utilize her specifically for PvE, you kind of have to go the route of either a CTP of Rage or a Judgment, since her third skill has to be kind of delay cancelled and will more than often proc or activate your CTP. So if you're using something like an Energy or Destruction, it might screw up your rotation and you might end up not proccing on the skill that you want, which is why a Rage and a Judgment are probably more ideal. You can see just how much better she is in PvE compared to Rocket, since she's able to complete stage 9 of Null 30 seconds ahead of him and has enough burst damage to skip some of his phases to get that kind of clear time. The PvE comparison becomes even more evident when you go into the higher stages. So for Mantis, going to stage 29 without leadership or supports, she's able to complete the first phase of Null within that 2-minute window, whereas Rocket could do it only for around stage 24 despite the restrictions. It became pretty clear once I took the character to stage 34 and added leadership and supports similar to Rocket that she was the better option for PvE. She was able to complete the same stage about a minute faster, and her burst damage made the last part of the fight a non-problem since she had enough to take down those last 5 bars, whereas for Rocket it became a little bit problematic. Even though the character doesn't satisfy any restrictions for Alliance Battle modes, so she largely won't be used for it, I decided to do a test in Alliance Battle Extreme just to see how she would compare relative to Rocket, and it was pretty much night and day. She was able to score around 6 million with the same build, almost 2 million more than Rocket by the end of the 3 minutes, which shows you that she not only has more hits on her skills, but also deals more damage. The rotation for Mantis is also a lot simpler than Rocket's, like I mentioned. You essentially just do the third skill and delay cancel it after about a half second once the green AoE effect appears. Then you do a 5 cancel 4, and just with that, she's basically able to outperform Rocket with that basic rotation. Once you have access to your awakening skill, you can use that either right in the beginning or possibly after the third skill, so that once you have your damage proc up, all of the skills that deal damage are active at the same time. So you can either do it before the third skill or after, but the rotation stays the same. As you can see, even without a damage proc, she's able to complete the first phase within that 2-minute window, and is able to do that 20 seconds faster than Rocket with the same team setup. The sad part about this comparison is that Rocket also has his own support, and even with that, Mantis outperforms him in PvE. But besides that, she also has way more PvP value because of the passive that she provides, which means that Rocket basically has to be a good standalone character, which he is kind of okay, but he's only a mid-level character because he doesn't have some of those top effects that you need to be basically a meta character for PvP. He doesn't have iframe ignore, and the only thing that he really has going for him is that he has some decent partial iframes scattered throughout his kit. I would probably recommend a CTP of Authority or a Destruction for the character. I went with Authority because he usually opens with his 5th skill, which, even though it does have 3 seconds of Invincible, does leave him pretty vulnerable since it's not an iframe skill, and oftentimes he'll drop to that 50 health bar mark, activating the accumulation and allowing him to deal more damage. Besides that, he often follows up with an iframe skill, so he does possibly get a chance to activate that Invincible again, and versus characters at a mid-level who don't have much iframe ignore or penetration, he can end up having some pretty decent survivability. Besides that, one of the other reasons why I leaned on Authority versus Destruction is because his skills do have a little bit of a wind-up time. So if you try to go with Destruction and take out some meta characters, they can potentially attack before you, and since they also have penetration, they can go through the invincible that you have on the 5th skill and take you out before you're able to proc and do the same to them. Even though Rocket and Mantis function pretty similarly as standalone characters, Mantis does end up being the better option for PvP because she not only has a better support function, but also has some PvP centered skills. She has, for example, penetration and an awakened skill, which allows her to basically burst down the second team in Alliance Conquest simply by surviving the first fight. Just to clarify, that's penetration on the awakened skill, not in her kit, but that's still better than nothing. Mantis also has an AoE debuff skill on her 3rd, which basically means that you can cleanse your own team. And in addition to that, she also has Super Guard Break on her 4th skill, which can allow her to basically lock down the opponent team. And then lastly, the most valuable thing of all is that she has that 30% damage mitigation from either supervillains or superheroes, which is very similar to Colossus's passive, just at lower values. And if you've played Timeline or Alliance Conquest, you would know just how great Colossus's passive is, which Mantis has a part of, as well as some other effects. As you saw from the last part of the clip, one of the downsides of her kit is that she usually opens with the 3rd skill and stays in it for a good amount of time from the animation, but doesn't have too many protections from it. She just has that damage immunity, so if the opponent has penetration, they can take her out while she's doing that skill. But if she survives past the 3rd skill, she'll often go into her 5th skill, which is a full iframe and deals a lot of damage, and then often follows up with the 4th skill, which has that Super Guard Break and can lock down the opponent. Even though it might seem like opening with the 3rd skill isn't great, it does provide that AoE passive buff to your team, which not only increases their crit and other stats, but also cleanses them of any CC effects. Because Mantis will often be used as a support for meta characters versus meta characters, she likely won't survive too long regardless of the build that you give her, so a CTP of Insight will probably be the most value for her, especially if you can reforge it to get that pierce damage reduction. If you want the character to be a little bit more standalone while also providing that support function, a CTP of Regen is also a decent alternative because she goes into invincible often with that 4th skill, and it also provides 30% healing when she does that. In addition to that, if you get the penetration when reforging to the mighty CTP of Regen, then you can also interrupt opponent's skills, which could save your meta characters. If you want to see some Alliance Conquest footage of Rocket, you can check out the Star-Lord video that I posted yesterday. It has Rocket featured in that same team, so you can see how he performs there. I don't really have any clips of Mantis in Alliance Conquest because I was just using her support function similar to how you would use Colossus, and most of the time she would end up dying fighting meta characters, which is why I would recommend going with an Insight first, because you're likely going to be using her in that way. But even with an Insight, she did end up surviving a good amount, and the character is overall pretty solid for PvP and pretty good for PvE, which is why I would easily recommend Mantis over Rocket. Rocket really only provides you value in Alliance Battle Legend modes and possibly Alliance Battle Extreme if you use Star-Lord there, but outside of that, he doesn't really perform that well as a standalone character. He's basically just average or a little bit above that. And honestly, I think he needs a buff, but I'm not really going to chase that because there are plenty of characters that need buffs that haven't really been touched ever since they were released with their latest uniforms. The least they could do, though, is to change his passive that affects Guardians of the Galaxy tagged characters and make it provide all attack as opposed to just damage that applies to energy-based characters. Hopefully that video helped you decide whether to pick up those uniforms or not, or if you already had them, what builds you might want to use for Rocket or Mantis. The next video that I'll be making is for Groot and then Gamora with their latest uniforms, which will likely drop next week around Tuesday. My hope was that Groot would get an awakening skill so that he would become a lot better for PvP and Alliance Conquest. However, he's only getting a T3, so hopefully he at least gets a support function so that he boosts the damage of Guardians of the Galaxy tagged characters, but hopefully also provides a ton of healing and kind of an aura passive to all characters that would make him really useful for PvP, because I don't know how good his standalone function is, but if he becomes pretty good standalone and has a revive, that could be pretty awesome for PvP as well. I don't really see him doing too much for PvE, but that is totally up to them and how they make the uniforms. Based off Gamora's last uniform, she'll likely be for PvE, so I don't really expect for her to have too much of a PvP function. She's probably just going to be centered towards pushing Alliance Battle Extreme, Alliance Battle Legend, and World Boss Legend stages that have her restriction. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others. It could help them out, and it helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.